You probably think hillbilly lunches were just mason jars of beans and day-old biscuits. But the working folks across Appalachia packed some of the most clever, practical meals in American history. These weren't recipes from cookbooks. They were survival strategies passed down through generations in the coal camps of West Virginia, the tobacco hollers of Kentucky, and the logging towns scattered through Tennessee and Virginia. We're talking about real food that real families depended on from the 1880s clear through the 1970s. Let's explore 25 lunch traditions that kept mountain workers alive and then quietly disappeared. Possum and sweet potatoes. Before you wrinkle your nose, understand that possum was considered fine dining in mountain communities, especially when prepared with sweet potatoes for Sunday dinner. This dish represented the pinnacle of Appalachian game cooking, turning a humble marsupial into a feast worthy of special occasions. Possums were typically caught in late fall, when they'd been feeding on persimmons and acorns, giving their meat a surprisingly sweet flavor. The preparation began with careful skinning and cleaning, followed by a thorough scrubbing and overnight soaking in salt water to remove any wild taste. The possum was then parboiled to tenderize the meat and remove any remaining gaminess. After parboiling, the possum was stuffed with sweet potatoes, wild onions, and sage if available. The whole animal was roasted slowly in a Dutch oven buried in coals, basting frequently with its own fat mixed with molasses or sorghum. The sweet potatoes inside absorbed the rich meat juices, while the skin turned crispy and golden, almost like roast pork. The finished dish was served with cornbread and wild greens, creating a meal that would make city folks reconsider their assumptions about country cooking. The meat was tender, slightly sweet from its diet of fall fruits, and the sweet potatoes became almost candy from the meat drippings and molasses. This was Sunday food, special occasion food, the kind of meal you served when the preacher came to dinner or when family visited from out of town. It represented skill in the kitchen and respect for your guests. By the 1970s, younger generations were embarrassed by the idea of serving possum, even though it had been a mark of hospitality for their grandparents. The tradition faded as cultural attitudes shifted and store-bought meat became the norm. Turtle soup with cornbread, mountain streams, and ponds provided more than just water. They offered protein in the form of snapping turtles that could weigh 20 pounds or more. This wasn't backwoods desperation food. Turtle soup was considered a delicacy that rivaled anything served in fancy city hotels, at least among those who knew how to prepare it properly. Catching snapping turtles required courage and skill. These prehistoric-looking creatures could snap off fingers with their powerful jaws. Once caught, the turtle was cleaned and the meat removed from the shell, revealing surprisingly tender flesh that tasted like a cross between chicken and fish. The various cuts of turtle meat provided different textures and flavors, from the tender tail meat to the chewier leg portions. The preparation was elaborate, befitting its special status. The turtle meat was cut into chunks and slowly simmered with wild onions, herbs, and root vegetables until it fell apart. Some cooks added hard-boiled eggs and a splash of vinegar for tang. The finished soup was thick, rich, and deeply flavorful, with a complexity that came from the long cooking process and a unique flavor of turtle meat. It was served alongside fresh cornbread to soak up every drop of that precious broth. Turtle soup was reserved for special occasions and honored guests, proving that mountain cuisine could rival any city restaurant when ingredients and skill combined. The taste was unlike anything else, slightly muddy but in a pleasant way, rich and meaty with an almost sweet undertone. By the 1970s, snapping turtles were becoming less common due to habitat loss and pollution. The knowledge of how to properly clean and prepare them was fading. Younger people found the idea of eating turtle strange or even disturbing. The tradition of turtle soup disappeared quickly, remembered now mostly in stories from older generations about the special meals their grandparents used to prepare. Groundhog stew. If you think groundhogs were just for weather predictions, mountain families knew better. These plump, slow-moving rodents provided the first fresh meat after winter's lean months. In February, when preserved meat supplies ran dangerously low, men would hunt the newly awakened groundhogs emerging from hibernation. These animals had spent months building up fat reserves, making them surprisingly tender and flavorful when properly prepared. After skinning and cleaning, the groundhog was cut into chunks and soaked overnight in salt water to remove any wild gaminess. The meat was then browned in pork fat before being covered with water, wild onions, and whatever root vegetables the family had stored, typically potatoes, carrots, and turnips. The stew simmered for hours over wood fire until meat fell off the bone and the broth turned rich and golden. One groundhog could feed a family of 6 for 2 days, making it precious winter protein when other meat was scarce. The taste was similar to rabbit but richer, with a slight gaminess that the long cooking process mellowed into something almost sweet. This wasn't desperation food to the people who ate it. It was seasonal bounty, the first fresh meat after months of salt pork and dried beans. Children would get excited when their father came home with a groundhog, knowing that supper would be something special. The stew would be served with cornbread for soaking up that rich broth, and nothing would go to waste. By the 1960s, hunting groundhogs for food started seeming backward. Grocery stores stocked fresh meat year-round. The younger generation didn't want to be associated with eating rodents, even though their grandparents had depended on it. By the 1970s, this tradition had mostly disappeared except in the most remote areas where old ways died hard. Pepperoni rolls. Giuseppe Argiro had a problem to solve in 1927. His bakery sat in Fairmont, West Virginia, surrounded by coal mines running 3 shifts a day. Miners needed food that could survive 12 hours underground in 100-degree tunnels without spoiling or getting contaminated by coal dust. Argiro's answer became a West Virginia legend that lasted nearly a century. He took his bread dough, rolled it flat, placed a whole stick of pepperoni down the center, sometimes added a slice of provolone, then sealed everything inside and baked it golden. The pepperoni, salt, and oils worked as natural preservatives. The sealed bread kept out mine dust and moisture. When a miner bit into one deep in a shaft, he got that spicy, greasy punch that made terrible coffee taste decent and gave him enough fuel to swing a pickaxe for another 4 hours. This wasn't artisan food. It was engineering. The bread stayed soft because the pepperoni oils migrated outward during baking. The meat stayed safe because the salt content prevented bacterial growth even in wet, warm conditions. Miners' wives could make a dozen on Sunday night, and their husbands would have lunch sorted for the week. By the 1970s, every gas station and corner store in coal country sold pepperoni rolls. Then the mines started closing. The tradition faded except in a few stubborn bakeries that remember what that bread roll actually meant. Fried catfish and hush puppies. Mountain streams provided more than just cool water for drinking. They were home to whiskered catfish that became the centerpiece of legendary fish fries that brought entire communities together. These weren't delicate trout fishing expeditions. Catching catfish required patience, strong hands, and sometimes the courage to reach into dark holes where big cats lurked, a technique called noodling that risked serious injury. Fresh-caught catfish were cleaned and skinned, revealing firm white meat that was surprisingly sweet and mild despite the fish's bottom-feeding reputation. The fillets were soaked in buttermilk overnight to remove any earthy taste, then dredged in seasoned cornmeal that created a golden, crunchy coating when fried in hot lard. The key was getting the fat hot enough that the coating sealed immediately, keeping the fish moist inside. Alongside the fish came hush puppies, cornmeal fritters mixed with chopped onions, and sometimes a little sugar, dropped by spoonfuls into the same hot fat. Legend says hush puppies got their name from cooks who tossed them to barking dogs with command, "Hush, puppies." Whether that's true or not, these little cornmeal balls were the perfect complement to fried fish. The combination of crispy outside, flaky inside catfish with hot, slightly sweet hush puppies created a meal that satisfied both body and soul. This was community food, the kind of meal where neighbors gathered around big cast iron kettles of hot grease, frying fish and telling stories until well after dark. Children would run around playing while adults supervised the frying, and everyone would eat until they couldn't move. By the 1970s, fish fries were still happening, but the tradition was changing. Propane fryers replaced with fires. Store-bought fish sometimes replaced caught catfish. The communal aspect was fading as families became more isolated and self-sufficient. The knowledge of how to properly clean catfish and make hush puppies from scratch was slowly disappearing, replaced by frozen fish sticks and pre-made mixes. Fried green tomatoes. September frost was the enemy of every mountain garden. When the first cold snap threatened, families stripped every tomato plant bare. The hard green tomatoes that wouldn't ripen in time became lunch staples throughout Appalachia starting in the 1890s. The preparation required more skill than you'd think. Slice them thick, about half an inch, so they wouldn't fall apart during frying. Dip each slice in buttermilk if you had it, plain water if you didn't. Dredge them through cornmeal, seasoned with salt and black pepper. Some families mixed in a little wheat flour to help the coating stick better. Then into a hot skillet with bacon grease, they'd go, frying until both sides developed that golden brown crust. The transformation was remarkable. Heat softened the tomato just enough to create contrast. Crunchy exterior, firm and tangy interior. These weren't just clever, they were strategic. Fried green tomatoes could sit at room temperature all morning without getting soggy. The acidity prevented spoilage. Loggers and coal miners ate them cold, straight from the tin pail, enjoying that sharp bite that cut through the heaviness of biscuits and salt pork. The technique survived in some families into the 1970s, but required knowing how to fry and cast iron and understanding the right cornmeal texture. When non-stick pans and convenience foods took over, this kind of from-scratch preparation seemed like too much work. Now it mostly shows up on restaurant menus as a curiosity, served hot with fancy sauces. Nothing like the cold, practical version that working folks depended on. Ham sandwiches on thick sliced bread. Before Wonder Bread, there was farm bread. Massive loaves baked once weekly in wood-fired ovens, sliced thick as your thumb. From the 1870s to the 1940s, these sandwiches were more bread than filling, but that's exactly what hard labor demanded. The ham was country ham, salt cured and aged for months in smokehouses, sliced thin but intensely flavored. A single slice of that salty, ruby red ham between two slabs of dense homemade bread created a lunch that could last. The bread would be slightly stale by morning, which was perfect. It held together better and didn't get soggy. Some folks spread lard on the bread for moisture. Others added nothing. The salt from the ham would slowly penetrate the bread as it sat in the lunch pail, seasoning each bite naturally. These sandwiches went into coal mines, tobacco fields, and logging camps across Appalachia. They delivered carbohydrates for energy, protein for muscle maintenance, and enough salt to replace what sweat took away during 10-hour shifts. The beauty was in the simplicity. No lettuce to wilt, no tomato to make things soggy, no mayonnaise to spoil in the heat. Just bread dense enough to fill a stomach, and ham salty enough to make you crave the water you'd pack separately. This wasn't gourmet food. It was calculated nutrition that kept men working when their bodies wanted quit. When sliced bread became standard and refrigeration made fresh ingredients practical, these massive sandwiches started seeming old-fashioned. By the 1970s, younger workers wanted variety and flavor, not just fuel. The tradition of thick sliced bread sandwiches faded into memory. Salt pork sandwiches. Before refrigeration, pork was preserved in salt, packed in wooden barrels with layers of coarse salt between each cut. The result was meat so salty it was almost inedible without preparation, but it would last for months without spoiling. For lunch, families would slice salt pork thin. It looked like thick bacon but was white with fat, streaked with lean pink meat. They'd rinse it briefly in cold water to remove surface salt, then place it between two slices of bread. No cooking, no additional seasoning, just bread and extremely salty pork. The salt would leach into bread as it sat in the lunch pail, seasoning each bite. This sandwich was pure sodium and fat, designed to replace what sweat took away during brutal labor. From the 1850s through the 1930s, salt pork sandwiches sustained miners, loggers, and farmhands across Appalachia. The pork was chewy, intensely salty, and the fat would sometimes be partially translucent and slippery. You'd need water afterward, lots of water. But that salt and fat combination kept muscles working and prevented the cramping that came from dehydration and sodium loss. These sandwiches weren't about taste. They were about biological necessity. By the 1970s, fresh meat had become affordable and accessible even in remote areas. Salt pork sandwiches seemed like poverty food from a bygone era. The tradition disappeared quickly as soon as better options became available. Bean sandwiches. Yes, beans between bread. This wasn't a joke. It was a serious fuel. The night before, leftover pinto beans would be mashed slightly with a fork, creating a thick paste that could spread. In the morning, this bean paste went between 2 slices of bread. No lettuce, no tomato, no condiments. Just beans and bread. The beans provided protein and fiber. The bread gave carbohydrates. The whole thing could survive hours in a lunch pail without falling apart. Some families added a little bacon grease to the beans for moisture and flavor. Others included a slice of raw onion for bite. From the 1900s through the 1960s, bean sandwiches sustained workers who couldn't afford meat daily. The sandwich was filling, cheap, and surprisingly satisfying. The beans' earthy, creamy texture contrasted with the bread's density. It stuck to your ribs, meaning it kept you full for hours of hard labor. Modern folks might turn their noses up, but to a tobacco farmer in 1935, this sandwich represented a full belly and the energy to finish a 12-hour day in the fields. The taste was simple and honest. Beans taste like beans. Bread tastes like bread. Together, they created complete protein, providing all the amino acids the human body needs to function. By the 1970s, as wages improved and pre-packaged lunches became available, bean sandwiches seemed too plain. The tradition faded as people sought more variety and flavor in their daily meals. Soup beans in mason jars. Hot food in a cold lunch wasn't common, but soup beans in mason jars solved that problem. The night before, a mother would cook a pot of pinto beans with fatback or a ham bone for flavor until they were soft and swimming in their own thick, starchy broth. While still hot, she ladled them into wide-mouthed mason jars, sealed them tight, and wrapped them in newspaper or old towels. The insulation kept them warm for hours. By lunch, they'd still be lukewarm, and the flavors would have deepened as they sat. A worker would unscrew the lid and eat directly from the jar with a spoon carried in his pocket. The beans were creamy, rich with pork fat, and seasoned simply with salt and pepper. This wasn't fancy food. These were survival beans, thick enough to be almost solid, providing plant protein when meat was scarce. From the 1900s to the 1950s, soup beans in jars sustained miners, loggers, and farmers across Appalachia. The jars were reusable and durable. They created their own mini pressure cooking effect as they cooled, intensifying flavors naturally. The beans would stick to the sides of the jar, requiring scraping to get every last bit of nutrition. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be afforded to waste. By the 1970s, thermoses became affordable and provided better insulation. The practice of carrying hot beans in mason jars faded, but for decades, it represented practical engineering that kept working families fed. Corn pone. Before sliced bread became standard, mountain families perfected their own daily staple that could outlast store-bought loaves by weeks. In the late 1800s through the Great Depression, corn pone served as a foundation of mountain survival. When wheat flour cost cash money that families simply didn't have, women would mix coarse cornmeal with just enough water or buttermilk to form a thick paste, adding a pinch of salt and sometimes bacon grease for richness. The mixture was shaped by hand into thick, flat cakes and either baked on a hot stone by the fire or fried in a cast iron skillet over with coals. The outside developed a golden, crackling crust while the inside stayed dense and moist with a slightly gritty texture that satisfied hunger like nothing else could. A woman's reputation often rested on her corn pone recipe. The balance between crust and interior, the right amount of salt, the proper thickness all mattered. Corn pone could last for days without spoiling. It traveled well, filled stomachs cheaply, and required only the most basic ingredients. Workers would eat it plain with molasses or crumbled into soup beans. It was bread, but also more than bread. It was proof that mountain family could survive on almost nothing and still maintain dignity. By the 1970s, commercial cornbread mixes had taken over. The art of making proper corn pone by feel and experience was fading. Now it mostly survives as a historical curiosity rather than a daily necessity. Cornmeal mush cakes. Leftover cornmeal mush, that thick porridge made from cornmeal and water, got a second life as lunch. The night before, a family would cook cornmeal mush for supper, eating it hot with milk or buttermilk. The leftovers would be poured into a loaf pan and left to cool overnight. By morning, it had solidified into a firm, sliceable block. Cut thick slices, fry them in bacon grease until both sides were crispy and golden, and you had cornmeal mush cakes. These could go into a lunch pail still warm, or they'd be eaten cold hours later. Either way, they were substantial. Each cake was dense with cornmeal, crispy on the outside, soft and porridge-like inside. Some folks ate them with sorghum. Others preferred them plain. From the 1880s through the 1950s, these cakes were standard lunch fare because they used up leftovers and required no additional ingredients. They were the ultimate budget-stretching food. A single batch of cornmeal could become multiple meals. Hot porridge for supper, fried cakes for lunch, and any remaining pieces could be crumbled into buttermilk for another meal. Nothing was wasted, and every transformation added value. The taste was pure corn, with the added richness of bacon grease and the textural contrast between crispy exterior and soft interior. By the 1970s, this kind of careful leftover management seemed old-fashioned. Pre-packaged foods replaced these homemade solutions. Cornbread and buttermilk. From the 1850s through the 1950s, this combination defined mountain lunches. Sharecroppers, coal miners, and timber workers carried it in mason jars and tin pails to work sites across the South. The night before, mothers would bake cornbread in a cast iron skillet. Stone-ground cornmeal, buttermilk, lard, and maybe an egg if the chickens were producing. The result was dense and substantial, nothing like the sweet, cake-like cornbread that became popular later. Come morning, they'd crumble chunks of that cornbread into a wide-mouthed mason jar and pour cold buttermilk over it until the bread was nearly covered. By lunchtime, magic had happened. The cornbread absorbed the tangy buttermilk, creating a thick mixture you could eat with a spoon. The sourness of the buttermilk acted as a preservative, keeping everything safe even in summer heat. This wasn't food for pleasure. It was cheap protein and calories with that probiotic punch of cultured milk that settled hard-working stomachs. Men would sit in tobacco fields or at mine shaft entrances, spooning this mixture and washing it down with well water, fueling themselves for another 6 hours of brutal labor. The combination provided complete nutrition. The cornmeal offered complex carbohydrates. The buttermilk delivered protein, calcium, and beneficial bacteria. Together they cost almost nothing and kept a man working when his family couldn't afford meat. By the 1960s, this practice had mostly disappeared. Refrigeration became common, making fresh milk accessible. Pre-packaged lunches from stores seemed more modern. But for nearly a century, cornbread and buttermilk kept Appalachian workers alive. If you're enjoying this look back at real American food history, hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more forgotten recipes and traditions to explore together. Cornbread with molasses poured over. This was different from cornbread and buttermilk. This was straight-up sweetness and density, designed for maximum energy delivery. Workers would take a thick square of cold cornbread, place it in a tin pail, and pour dark molasses directly over it right before leaving for work. By lunchtime, the molasses had soaked completely through, turning the cornbread into something between cake and pudding. The contrast was remarkable. The gritty texture of stone-ground cornmeal against the smooth, almost syrupy thickness of molasses. This combination was pure energy. The cornmeal provided complex carbohydrates that released slowly, while molasses delivered an immediate sugar rush plus iron. From the 1890s through the 1940s, this lunch kept farmers in tobacco fields and miners underground functioning when they couldn't stop for a proper meal. The molasses added deep, almost bitter sweetness, nothing like white sugar's clean taste. It had mineral notes, a slight sulfuric tang, and a richness that made plain cornbread taste luxurious. Folks would scrape the tin clean with their fingers, not wasting a drop of that thick, black syrup. The preparation was so simple, it almost wasn't a recipe. But the results kept men working through conditions that would otherwise have broken them. By the 1970s, refined sugar had become cheap and molasses seemed old-fashioned. The younger generation preferred candy bars and packaged snacks. Within a decade, this traditional lunch had mostly disappeared. Lard biscuits. These weren't just biscuits made with lard. They were biscuits that were mostly lard. During the leanest times when flour was precious, mountain cooks made lard biscuits that were essentially lard held together with just enough flour to form dough. Mix cold lard with minimal flour, a pinch of salt, and barely enough buttermilk to bring it together. Roll it out cut circles, and bake until barely golden. The result was incredibly rich, almost greasy, and packed with calories. One or two of these biscuits could fuel a man through half a workday. They were dense, slightly crumbly, and left your fingers shiny with fat. From the 1890s through the 1940s, lard biscuits went into lunch pails when money was tight and bellies needed filling. Workers would eat them plain or with sorghum molasses, the sweetness cutting through the animal fat richness. These biscuits represented the reality of poverty. They were cheap calories when nothing else was available. Lard was rendered from hog butchering in the fall, stored in crocks, and used sparingly throughout the year. But when tobacco prices dropped or the mine closed temporarily, lard biscuits kept families working until better times returned. The taste was pure fat, with just enough wheat flavor to remind you it was bread. Modern health consciousness will reject these completely, but in their time, they were survival technology. By the 1970s, commercial baked goods had replaced this kind of desperate from-scratch cooking. Cold biscuits with sorghum. Leftover biscuits never went to waste in mountain households. From the 1880s through the 1960s, families saved the previous night's biscuits for next-day lunches. These weren't fluffy, buttery southern biscuits from a restaurant. These were working biscuits made with lard and minimal leavening, designed to fill stomachs cheaply. By morning, they'd be cold and slightly firm. A worker would split the biscuit and drizzle dark sorghum molasses over each half. Sorghum was cheaper than white sugar and provided deep, almost earthy sweetness with mineral tang that refined sugar couldn't match. The thick syrup would soak into the dense biscuit, creating pockets of sweetness throughout. This combination delivered immediate energy from the molasses and sustained fuel from the wheat and lard. The sorghum also provided iron, which mountain diets often lacked. Timber workers would eat these standing up, syrup dripping onto their boots, getting that sugar rush before tacking another day of felling trees with hand saws and steep terrain. The taste was complex. Sorghum has a slightly bitter edge, a sulfuric note, and a richness that's nothing like modern corn syrup or honey. Mixed with the dense, lard-heavy biscuit, it created a flavor profile that felt substantial and satisfying in a way that sweet breakfast pastries never could. By the 1960s, commercial breakfast foods were marking themselves as modern and convenient. Making biscuits from scratch seemed old-fashioned. Sorghum production declined as sugar became cheaper. Within a generation, this breakfast and lunch staple had mostly disappeared from daily life. Pickled eggs and cornbread. When chickens laid heavily in spring and summer, mountain families pickled dozens of eggs to preserve them for leaner months. They'd hard-boil fresh eggs, peel them, and pack them into jars filled with vinegar brine, sometimes with beet juice for color or hot peppers for bite. After a week in the brine, these eggs transformed into tangy, firm protein bombs. For lunch, a worker would grab 2 or 3 pickled eggs and a chunk of cornbread. The combination was strategic. The sharp, acidic punch of the vinegar egg cut through the dense, slightly sweet cornbread, creating a balanced meal that sat well in the stomach during heavy labor. The eggs provided protein and fat. The cornbread delivered carbohydrates. The vinegar aided digestion. From the 1880s through the 1960s, this pairing was standard in coal camps and tobacco fields. The eggs were sour, salty, and had that distinctive pickle firmness. The yolk would be slightly dry and crumbly, turning almost chalky from the vinegar. Men would eat them whole, alternating bites of egg with bites of cornbread, washing everything down with creek water or weak coffee from a thermos. The taste was aggressive, not subtle or refined, but it delivered what working bodies needed. The vinegar helped replace electrolytes lost through sweat. The protein fueled muscles. The cornbread provided sustained energy. When refrigeration became common, pickling eggs for preservation seemed unnecessary. By the 1970s, this lunch combination had mostly disappeared except in the most traditional families. Killed lettuce salad. Killed lettuce was fresh lettuce wilted with hot bacon grease and vinegar, creating a salad that could actually survive in a lunch pail. Early spring, when leaf lettuce first emerged in mountain gardens, was killed lettuce season. Women would tear fresh lettuce leaves into a bowl, fry several strips of bacon until crispy, then pour the hot grease directly over the greens while it was still sizzling. The lettuce would wilt immediately, hence killed. Add a splash of vinegar, crumble the bacon over top, and you had a warm salad that could be packed for lunch. By midday, it had cooled but remained edible and flavorful. The bacon grease coated each leaf. The vinegar provided acid that helped preserve everything and added brightness. The bacon pieces contributed protein and crunch. From the 1880s to the 1950s, this was a way to get fresh vegetables into working men's diets when vitamin deficiency was a real threat. The killed lettuce was slippery, tangy, smoky, and rich. Men would eat it from tin pails with their fingers or crude forks, enjoying the first fresh greens after winter dried beans and preserved meat. The taste represented spring's arrival and the end of the hardest season. By the 1970s, fresh salads with bottled dressing seemed more modern and appealing. The practice of killing lettuce with hot grease faded, seeming too old-fashioned and unhealthy by contemporary standards. Raw ramps and biscuits. Ramps, wild leeks that grow in Appalachian forests each spring, were more than food. They were a ritual. From April through early May, families would forage hillsides for these pungent wild onions with their purple-stained bulbs and broad green leaves. Eating raw ramps was almost a rite of passage. Workers would pack several ramps and cold biscuits for lunch, eating them raw right there in the field or mine. The ramps were intensely strong, part garlic, part onion, part something wilder and more primal. They'd bite into the white bulb, the juice making their eyes water, then chase it with a chunk of biscuit to absorb the burn. The combination was harsh and wonderful. The aggressive sharpness of raw ramp against the bland, dense biscuit. Your breath would reek for days afterward, but everyone ate them, so everyone smelled the same. This was communal eating at its most basic. The ramps provided vitamins and minerals that winter diets had depleted. From the 1700s onward, mountain folks believed ramps thinned the blood after a heavy winter of salt meat and beans. Modern science suggests they were right. The sulfur compounds in vitamins did help bodies transition to spring work. By the 1970s, this tradition was fading as younger workers found the strong taste and social consequences embarrassing. The practice survived mostly among older generations who remembered when ramps represented spring survival. Leather britches. The name sounds strange, but leather britches kept families fed with vegetables long after gardens went dormant. These were green beans strung on thread and dried until they looked like old leather strips. This preservation method was used throughout Appalachia. From the 1700s onward, women would string fresh green beans, usually Kentucky Wonders, onto heavy thread using a large needle. They'd create long garlands that hung from kitchen rafters. The beans would dry for weeks, turning brown and leathery. Come winter and spring, when fresh vegetables were impossible to get, a handful of these dried beans would go into a lunch pail. At the work site, they'd be eaten as is. They were tough and required serious chewing, but they provided fiber and minerals. Some miners would pour hot water over them from a thermos, letting them rehydrate slightly before eating. The beans had an intense, concentrated flavor, earthy, slightly smoky if they'd hung near the wood stove, and deeply vegetable in a way that fresh beans never achieved. They tasted like forward planning and hard work. Modern folks might find them unappetizing, but to a coal miner in 1920, they represented summer sunshine in the middle of a dark shaft. They proved that his wife knew how to keep the family fed year-round, which was knowledge more valuable than money. By the 1970s, home freezers had become standard. Freezing green beans was easier than the time-consuming process of stringing and drying them. The knowledge of how to properly prepare leather britches stopped being passed down. Now it's mostly a curiosity demonstrated at heritage festivals. Salmon patties. Canned salmon was one of the few luxury proteins mountain family could afford, and they stretched it further than seemed possible. From the 1920s through the 1960s, salmon patties became a lunch staple that represented prosperity in a tin can. The night before, mothers would open a can of pink salmon. Bones, skin, everything went in. Nothing was wasted. They'd mash it with leftover cornbread or stale breadcrumbs, an egg if available, and chopped onion. Form a mixture into patties and fry them in bacon grease until both sides developed a crispy, golden crust. By morning, these patties were cold and firm, perfect for the lunch pail. They wouldn't fall apart, wouldn't spoil in moderate temperatures, and delivered fish oil richness that bodies needed. The bones, mashed in with everything else, provided calcium that mountain diets often lacked. Workers would eat them with their hands, the crispy exterior giving way to that soft, fishy center. The taste was distinctive. Salmon has a stronger flavor than most fish, and the canned version was even more intense. Mixed with cornbread and onion, then fried in bacon grease, it created a savory patty that satisfied hunger better than you'd expect from its simple ingredients. Ocean fish making its way to landlocked hollows felt like a small miracle to families who rarely saw fresh seafood. When fresh fish became more accessible through improved transportation and refrigeration in the 1970s, these canned salmon patties started seeming like poverty food. The tradition faded as people wanted fresh instead of preserved. Fried apple pies. These hand pies had nothing to do with the lattice-top beauties cooling on windowsills and magazine photographs. Mountain apple pies were built for punishment. They rode in lunch pails on horseback, sat in the sun during tobacco harvesting, and got tossed into work bags without a second thought. Women would take dried apple slices, saved from the previous autumn, and soak them overnight in water with sugar and cinnamon if the family budget allowed it. Next morning, they'd roll biscuit dough thin, cut 6-inch circles, and spoon that apple mixture onto one half. Fold it over, crimp the edges tight with fork, then drop the whole thing into a skillet of hot lard. Both sides would fry until golden, creating a sealed pocket that nothing could penetrate. The genius was in the engineering. That fried crust was basically armor. The concentrated sweetness of dried apples meant you didn't need much to feel satisfied. A logger could eat one of these at 10 in the morning and still taste that cinnamon apple flavor at noon. The pies never got soggy because the fried shell repelled moisture. They never spoiled because the sugar concentration and sealed environment prevented bacteria from gaining a foothold. By the 1960s, this kind of from-scratch cooking started seeming old-fashioned. Store-bought snack cakes were easier. But ask anyone who grew up eating these hand pies, and they'll tell you nothing from a cellophane wrapper ever came close to that first bite through crispy shell into warm, spiced apples. Stack cake slices. The Appalachian stack cake was engineering disguised as dessert. Dating back to the early 1800s, this cake consisted of thin, cookie-like layers stacked with dried apple filling. But here's what made it lunch-worthy. It actually improved with age. Families baked these cakes a week before they were needed. Each layer started as a thin round of dense dough made with sorghum or molasses for sweetness. These rounds were baked hard, creating discs that could survive transport without crumbling. Between each layer went a thick paste of dried apples cooked down with sugar and spices until it reached a jam-like consistency. The magic happened over days. Moisture from the apple filling would slowly seep into the dry cake layers, softening them into something almost fudgy. A mother would cut thick slices and wrap them in wax paper for the lunch pail. The low moisture content meant the cake wouldn't mold. The sugar and spice acted as preservatives. The whole thing could sit in a cool place for weeks without spoiling. Miners and loggers savored these slices as their midday treat. The dense sweetness provided quick energy. The concentrated apple flavor reminded them of home even in rough work camps far from family. At weddings, neighbors would each bring a layer, and the bride's family would stack them into a towering cake that symbolized community support. By the 1970s, this labor-intensive tradition was fading. Store-bought cakes were easier. The art of making paper-thin cake layers and properly drying apples was knowledge that stopped being passed down. Now stacked cake mostly survives as a curiosity at Appalachian heritage festivals. Dried apple slices. Simple, portable, and nearly indestructible. From the late 1700s onward, Appalachian families dried apples every fall as insurance against hunger. They'd core and slice apples thin, usually golden delicious or wine saps, and string them on thread or lay them on screens in the sun or near the wood stove. After weeks of drying, the slices would shrink to leathery rings concentrated with sugar and flavor. These went into every lunch pail. Workers would chew them slowly, rehydrating them slightly with saliva, releasing that intense apple sweetness. They were tough. You couldn't just bite through them. You had to gnaw and suck, making each piece last. The chewing motion itself was satisfying, giving jaw muscle something to do during breaks. These dried apples provided quick energy from natural sugars, required no refrigeration, wouldn't spoil for months, and weighed almost nothing. Loggers would carry pounds of them into week-long camps. Miners kept them in their pockets. Children would get a handful for school lunches. In lean times, these apple rings might be the only sweet thing a family had, making them precious beyond their simple ingredients. The taste was concentrated apple essence, like eating sunshine and autumn air compressed into chewy leather. Modern store-bought dried apples can't match the intensity of home-dried varieties made from heirloom apples that don't exist commercially anymore. By the 1970s, the time and knowledge required to properly dry apples seemed impractical. This preservation method faded as freezers became standard and store-bought snacks filled the void. Vinegar pie. This might sound insane, but vinegar pie was genius economics. During the Great Depression, when eggs, butter, and fresh fruit were too scarce or valuable to use for pie, mountain cooks invented the substitute. The filling was simple: flour, sugar, water, a little butter if available, and a surprising amount of vinegar. Mix it together, pour it into a simple pastry crust, and bake until set. The vinegar's acidity activated the flour starches, creating a custard-like filling without eggs or milk. The result tasted surprisingly like lemon pie, tart and sweet, with a custardy texture. A slice of this pie wrapped in wax paper became a lunch pail treat. It was shelf-stable, didn't need refrigeration, and wouldn't spoil even in summer heat. The high sugar and acid content acted as preservatives. From the 1920s through the 1940s, vinegar pie represented Appalachian ingenuity, creating something that tasted like luxury from the cheapest ingredients in the pantry. Workers would eat it with their hands, the flaky crust shattering into crumbs, the filling providing quick energy and a reminder that home meant more than just survival. The taste was sharp and sweet at the same time, with that distinctive vinegar tang that made your mouth water even as you swallowed. By the 1950s, as economic conditions improved, vinegar pie seemed like embarrassing poverty food. Families stopped making it, and the recipe nearly disappeared. Now it's mostly remembered as a curiosity from desperate times. These 25 lunches represent more than just food. They represent survival strategies passed down through generations, economic realities that shaped daily life, and communities that took care of each other when times got hard. From pepperoni rolls designed to survive coal mine conditions to turtle soup reserved for honored guests, each of these forgotten lunches tells a story about Appalachian resilience and ingenuity. Most of these traditions have faded into history. The knowledge of how to properly prepare them stopped being passed down as economic conditions improved and modern conveniences made from scratch cooking seem old-fashioned. But for nearly a century, these lunches kept working families alive across the mountains, providing the fuel needed to swing axes, dig coal, harvest tobacco, and build the backbone of American industry. What forgotten lunch from your family's history do you remember? Drop a comment below and let's keep these memories alive. And if you enjoyed this journey through Appalachian food history, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next exploration of forgotten American traditions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.